Good afternoon. I am Dr. Mascaram Gabagzabe, Assistant Clinical Professor and a Director of Inclusion and Community Engagement in the School of Human Evolution and Social Change here at Arizona State University. I feel incredibly privileged to be able to provide timely and important programming such as today's lecture and want to thank all of you for joining us. Welcome to the first event of 2023 in our Colloquium series titled Toward a Liberatory Theory and Praxis, with our 15th colloquium to date. This monthly series aims to highlight the work of contemporary scholars belonging to identities and traditions marginalized within mainstream Western academia, who through their work confront neocolonial power structures and challenge longstanding norms of knowledge production. It was born out of a demand from our graduate students for exposure to more critical scholarship that is relevant to their lived experiences and times in which we are living. Specifically, I want to thank Tisa Lowen, Aaliyah Hoff, and Drs. Anais Roque and Nalubega Ross, who worked with me to conceptualize this series and to establish its parameters. I also want to thank all of the staff who have and are helping behind the scenes to make this event happen: Nicole Pomerantz, Megan Martin, Alice Casey, and Danny Anderson. I also want to acknowledge CHESC leadership for supporting and sponsoring this series, specifically our unit director, Dr. Chris Stojanowski. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. Please note that this presentation and the Q&A session to follow is being recorded. You, the audience, will not be visible in the recording, and all of the mics will be turned off. But as I mentioned, we will be leaving time for questions after the talk, and we're asking that you write your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you would like to vocalize the question yourself rather than have me read it out, please write Ask Live in parentheses at the end of the question you submit using that Q&A button, and I will call on you and unmute your mic so that you may do so. Okay, so without any further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Tanya Saunders. Dr. Saunders is an associate professor in the Language, Literacy, and Culture doctoral program at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. They hold a PhD in sociology from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and a Master of International Development Policy from the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy. Dr. Saunders is interested in the ways in which the African diaspora throughout the Americas uses the arts as a tool for social change, specifically through the decolonizing systems of thinking and knowing in the Americas. In 2016, they were a co-recipient of 2 Abdias do Nascimento Awards funded by CAPES in Brazil. In their 2015 book, Cuban Underground Hip Hop, Black Thoughts, Black Revolution, was published by the University of Texas Press and is recently translated into Portuguese. In 2021 and 2022, Dr. Saunders was a scholar in residence at the Hutchins Center for African American and African Research at Harvard University. They were a recipient of the Mamolin Fellowship, which brings distinguished scholars in the fields of Afro-Latin American Studies to the Du Bois Research Institute. Dr. Saunders is also the director of the film project entitled Afrofeminismos en Cuba, which can be streamed on YouTube. They are currently working on a book tentatively titled Estéticas do Bafo, Queering Black Brazilian Artivism and Politics of Liberation. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Tanya L. Saunders.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be able to share my work with you today. This is drawn from an article that was just published in Brazil in English. And I'm in the process of revising this article for the chapter, one of the chapters for the forthcoming book. All right, I'm just going to go ahead and jump in and share the screen. Okay, so you can see, and I put subtitles on the screen for folks just in case that's useful. So, are Black women cisgender? Analyzing Brazilian Black gender interventions. So I want to start off with first a quote and then read a translation of an Instagram post from a poet and anarcho-activist, Formigão. The first quote is from Dora Santana. seeing our bodies, our knowledge production, creative work, and memories as places of resistance against racializing gendered violence against bodies that are not considered normative is where trans feminism and Black feminism meet. And keep in mind, I'm talking about trans feminism within the Brazilian context, which has a bit of a different foundation than trans feminism within the United States. And if you're interested in learning more about that, I can explain more about that in a question and answer. Now, formigón. For those who don't know who I am, I'm a masculine sapatón in search of friends and lovers, and I'm in shock, bro. Today, I registered to play in a lesbian and bi carnival group. So the sisters from the group came and complimented me, and I was feeling so like an artist. I was thinking that it would be chill considering that they tell me that there's no, but then I was thinking that it was chill. Just a side note, the way that Formigón writes is a very specific kind of way that's rooted in Black Portuguese, as well as anarchist way of writing. So bear with me, but hopefully you can follow along, but I'm trying to read as close to the way that he writes as possible. So the sisters from the group came and complimented me, and I was feeling so like an artist. I was thinking that it was chill, considering. Then they tell me that there's no way to allow me to play because they did not know how to position themselves in reference to the question of non-binary people within that space. So then I left, and I left the practice right there, and I was in shock because I wouldn't be able to build a lesbian space because it only accepted lesbian and bi women. First, if they hadn't put me in the WhatsApp group, I wouldn't have even known about this thing. And it's a jacked up situation to put me in, knowing that I could not go and play. Also, I had no way to check the phone. They could have sent me an audio, right? I spent the resources to get over there, and I couldn't be a part of the group. For someone who's unemployed like me, $4.40 for transportation makes a difference, right? I understand that there are sapatón that call themselves women as a feminist political strategy. These sisters from the carnival group of lesbians and bi say that their space is open for trans women. They say that they're allied with trans people, but could not understand how a Black and gendered masculine sapatón from the favela who wants to be called him and to be part of a lesbian community. These sisters focused on my dissidence from womanity as a way to not accept me into the group. And they did not focus on our link, which is lesbianism. These days, exchanging ideas with a sapatón brother friend of mine who told me that lesbophobia is part of our history, I understood that I understood this like a self-hate, and it kills our bodies and our minds. Not throwing shade, but I think that these lesbian and bi women are lesbophobic because they do not understand lesbian corporalities beyond womanity. They're only able to accept trans women in their crew, but they don't accept the ones from the front line. They don't accept them on the front line of their group. They don't accept a masculine sapatón. Could it be that this acceptance of trans women is a de facto inclusion on paper? Or I don't know. I thought that being a camioneta rolling, like with my cap, my backpack, or my large and wearing my large Black clothes, shaved hair, bofe paraíba, masculine queer, like these gringos say, a butch stone, stud butch, seems like a camioneta is an empty word. If they see a person like me and they don't recognize me as another sapatón only because I took it out of the name, I think that they asked me what I wanted in that kind of women's space, and I wanted to develop my ability to play something beyond bater siririca, which, as you should see, I put the keywords up in the slide just to kind of help understanding part of this. So right there, he's saying, beyond masturbating, right? I wanted to make friends and create networks of mutual support, solidarity, creative, effective connections to get to know future Black lovers, but there's only room there for camionetas that are women. So that's the end of that post. I start this presentation with a quote from the trans Black feminist scholar Dora Santana. and place her quote in conversation with the post from the non-binary masculine subaltern poet, activist, and anarchist Formigón, who posted that post on November 25th, 2021 on Instagram. In the post, Formigón details his disappointment at not being allowed to participate in a carnival group for lesbian and bi people. Formigón learned about the group because he was included in a WhatsApp group for lesbians. Given Formigón's gender identity, it made perfect sense to be included in the WhatsApp group and to be invited to participate in a carnival group for lesbian and bi people. There was no reason to suspect that upon his arrival to the group's practice, he would be excluded from participating because of his identity as a non-binary masculine sapatón. Sapatón, as I will discuss again later in this presentation, is a slur against women perceived to be lesbians, but the term has been taken up and re-signified by lesbian and feminist groups. As Formigón argues in his post, there are women who continue to call themselves sapatón as a feminist political strategy. However, the term is generally used by those who would be classified as lesbians within a Eurocentric Western ontology. They theorize sapatón as a gender category that disidentifies with the Eurocentric Western ontology, which opens the door to theorizing gender and implicitly sexuality from a Brazilian, indigenous, Afro-diasporic, or even Afro-indigenous ontology. Formigón argues that even though he shares a convergence with lesbian and bi women through the subject position sapatón, which is based on the lived experience associated with lesbianism, it is because he explicitly disidentified with the Eurocentric Western category of woman that he was excluded from the group. The group claims that is in solidarity with trans women and that they're welcome in the group, but some of the very people for which the group was created, people whose identities map onto or converge within a lesbian existence, are excluded. Formigón wonders if the group is actually in solidarity with trans women or if it's just a formality that they put on paper, but they're not in solidarity with trans people at all. To Formigón's point, the group would more than likely include trans women because trans women are women, thus identifying with and not challenging necessarily the white supremacy and Eurocentrism that underlies the category of woman as a normative gender category. That is, trans women, if we think from a historical medical perspective, even considering as problematic as it is, in the medical context, with all of its problems, the medical context naturalizes the category of woman as rooted in biology. This is what Oyewumi refers to as a colonial biologic. The 20th century medicalization of trans identities was rooted in the belief that trans identities could be addressed or quote unquote corrected psychologically and medically, that is biologically. The medicalized history of transgender identities centered on the process of transition as a way to correct a psychological disorder. The medical and psychological interventions permitted people who were assumed to be psychologically women, and it was usually almost always focused on women to be and live as women. It is important to note that while white transgender women could be like Christine Jorgensen, and this is initially, hailed as America's sweethearts in the mid-20th century, Black trans women and trans men were presented in newspapers as curious deviants. So today I center the epistemic interventions of Formigón and place him in conversation with Black trans and Black feminist theorists from across the Americas to consider these questions. Is a Black woman who's classified as female at birth the same as a white woman who was classified as female at birth? That is, are Black women who are classified as female as birth cisgender? What political implications does classifying Black women as cisgender have for anti-racist solidarity and decolonial activism? Today, I argue that the emergence of the unmarked cisgender category as a universalized identity and social marker in hegemonic, that is white dominated debates about gender diversity and social oppression undermines the interventions and political denouncements made by Black trans, Black feminists, and Black gender and sexual dissidents. In Brazil in particular, the term cisgender is increasingly being used to silence Black feminists, Black sapatões, Black lesbians, and activists who challenge the whiteness and anti-Black violence that often goes unaddressed in white, trans, and queer social movements. And again, I'm thinking about this across the hemisphere, but there are particular nuances that pertain to the Brazilian context in and of itself, but I think it offers us lessons to think about this across the diaspora. So this is not as common of an occurrence among activist communities within the US American context, where trans and disability studies locates its root in Black feminist studies and critical race theory. Thus, Black scholars and activists in the United States does not face the kind of vicious public attacks and social exclusion that Black activists and scholars face in Brazil when they are in conversation or debate with white, trans, queer, lesbian, and bi activists. Black scholars, Black folks live in a context where Black people, Black thought, and intellectuals are generally not respected outside of Black social movements. So if we think, again, in the Brazilian case, there's not one department of Black studies. There are no majors in Black or African diaspora studies. There's one PhD program in gender and sexuality studies. The ubiquity and the ease with which Black people, and especially Black women and sex gender deviants, are positioned as both oppressed and the aggressor or oppressor, while white mestizos position themselves as oppressed victims of Black aggression, allows a specifically Brazilian form of white fragility. In a context where white mestizos use their identity to declare, as Liv Solvik argues, that here in Brazil, no one is white, and therefore no one can be racist, white sex gender dissidents implicitly argue that since they're not cisgender nor heteronormative and not white, they cannot be oppressors, but only victims, instead of perhaps both, straddling both in complicated ways. If a white person, whether trans, lesbian, bi, or a sex gender dissident, is challenged on their racism and at times on their classism by a Black person, the Black person is always under threat of being seen as overly aggressive, perhaps even a bully, and is expected to address the issue in a way that actually respects and accommodates a type of Brazilian white mestizo fragility. However, in the case of a Black person, whether trans, bi, lesbian, or a sex gender dissident, no such overture is made to address, extend respect, or demonstrate empathy when seeking redress. Instead, all of the power behind whiteness that allows it to emotionally and psychologically annihilate that which it sees as a threat, inferior, or subordinate is directed at the non-white Afro-descendant body. In cases where cisgender, hetero, or homonormativity, all white supremacist ideologies cannot be leveled as justifications for discursive violence and the social exclusion of Black bodies, specifically Black sex gender dissidents, it is their racialized sex gender deviance or their refusal that is used to position them as a threat. So I'm in conversation with Brazilian scholars such as Fatima Lima, as well as other scholars throughout the Americas, such as Maria Luones and Horton Spillers, in thinking about how the coloniality of the race, sex, gender, class matrix limits white, trans, queer, and sex gender dissidents' capacities to be allies to Black people. It's not saying it can't be, but the kind of limits and complications this dynamic creates. That is, to work in solidarity with Black women and sapatões specifically, and Black trans sex gender dissidents in a broader sense. While Lugones focuses on the challenge of oppressed groups working together across gender, I want to think within a Brazilian context about the challenges of oppressed groups working together across race. Such a move would require white women, white queers, the white LGBT, trans, and travesti activists to think about power and their complicity in Brazilian white supremacy. This means recognizing that the discourse of challenging power, no matter where it is, can run contrary to the intended goal of fighting oppression. When a white minoritarian subject does not consider why they may feel threatened in a particular moment, the result can lead to forms of discursive violence and aggression against racialized minorities that have three major effects. First, it reproduces a colonial racial order centered on Black silence and subordination through naming, renaming, defining, and redefining what constitutes oppression. Second, the aggression negates that white minoritarian subjects are engaged in this form of effective necropolitics. This is done by reformulating the Brazilian discourse of mestizaje to argue that the psychological and affective nature of their sex gender oppression places them in a position of absolute precarity. They note that in comparison to US American whiteness, they are actually biologically non-white. Third, it co-opts discourses of difference and normalizes human difference and diversity within whiteness. By dismissing the fact that race was never about biology, but about relations of power symbolically encoded on the body, white mestizos are able to dismiss the reality that they are socialized to reproduce a Brazilian white supremacist social order. This erasure supports an internal narrative that their sex gender oppression overrides the kind of internalized anti-Black racism that is foundational to one's socialization as a white subject. In this way, again, Liv Slovic argues, aqui ninguém é branco. This move prevents non-white subjects from talking about how racism impacts gender and sexual identities because white mestizos can use the categories of difference to police and exclude Black sex gender dissidents who do not fit into white normative categories of difference. The result of this violent discursive aggression is that white sex gender dissidents are largely uncritical about their own implicit and at times explicit investment in whiteness, and it undermines and reinforces the racist and cisnormative and how whiteness undermines efforts at challenging the racist, cisnormative, Eurocentric gender regime that is at the root of their oppression as well, at the root of everybody's oppression. One manifestation of how the category cisgender is used to exclude Black sex gender dissidents from inclusion in interracial, non-normative, erotic, and social spaces is the case of what we saw with Formigón. Most critically, we are in a moment where Black people are in the process of reclaiming bodies, theorizing the various sex gender traumas that we have and continue to suffer individually and collectively. When white subjects weaponize the term cisgender, for example, in political context, and again, this is specifically very intense in Brazil at the moment, it results in the silencing of Black people's discussions about our bodies. The result is little space for Black people, whether they end up transitioning or not, to recognize and reconnect with our bodies so that we can decide what we would like to do with those bodies. In other words, Black people are just beginning to reclaim the space to be able to talk about their cool shushota, penis, clitoris, and everything in between. This space is not given and has rarely been given or extended within whiteness. White sex gender dissidents start their lives with the assumption that on some level they have a body. The question is then about their connection to or not that body, the ability to express affect, how to experience body, or the right to define themselves within their body. Black people, on the other hand, are in the process of reconnecting with the idea that we even have bodies, much less that we own them. Talking about a vulva, penis, clitoris, taint, or prostate for a Black and non-white Afro-descendant person points to a whole different set of meanings and effective psychological and decolonial processes, given the historicity of the Black body. As Norton points out, the history of gender and sexuality embodied by white bodies is not the same as those embodied by Black bodies. Black sex gender dissidents, Black genders and sexualities are not the same as those associated with whiteness. Thus, for a white trans woman, for example, to attack a so-called cisgender Black woman who has begun the process of embracing her vagina is a specific type of racial violence rooted in coloniality. Black people are rarely offered the space in the face of whiteness to talk about, name, understand, redefine our bodies. The negation is a reimposition of a Western Eurocentric biologic, while Eurocentric understandings of sex gender are defined and redefined within a colonial Eurocentric frame, and then universalized and imposed on all bodies. So here I'm employing the term Black gender to refer to the distinctiveness of Black sex gender embodiment within a Western context. Black gender recognizes the African, Afro-Indigenous, and Afro-diasporic nature of how Black genders are understood and embodied by Black people and non-white Afro-descendant people. It recognizes the historically constituted nature of Black genders as being imbued with coloniality. By invoking this term, I turn away from gender, which is a specifically Eurocentric, anti-Black, and anti-African ideology. It is imposed onto non-white bodies in which non-white persons are expected to imagine the constituted nature of their gender identities and experiences as being reflected only in European histories of embodiment, dating back to Greek and Roman empires, but stopping short of let's say, including Egypt, which is the ancient foundation of the modern West. And again, if we continued Western genealogy into Egypt, we would have to talk about Africa, Nubia, and therein we would end up undermining the colonial matrix imposed by Western European imperialism and its resultant white supremacist, cis-normative, as a racialized system, patriarchal, extractivist system. I also want to point to a door that is there, and that is Black folks from across the hemisphere are rethinking and redefining sex and gender based on our own histories, inherited non-European epistemologies and metaphysics. And when I talk about non-European epistemologies and metaphysics, I'm also pointing to Candomblé, Voodoo, Lukumi, Ifa within the Americas as also sites of the continuation of passing those non-European metaphysics on to other generations of folks. Formigon's work is an important example of this process and of what happens when Black genders and Black sexualities challenge Eurocentric, i.e. white, co-optation of difference. Here, I think it is important to note how I conceptualize whiteness. And again, I'm really engaging Brazilian white studies in terms of how I think about whiteness. I conceptualize whiteness as a normative Eurocentric ideological formation and effective register rooted in white supremacy and coloniality. This forms the basis for Eurocentric definitions of humanity, citizen, and the humanoid or human. In conversation with Jose Munoz's work, I conceptualize whiteness as an imposed and universalized modality, where those classified as white are assumed to embody this modality, while non-white populations are defined out of whiteness because they are understood as not embodying this modality due to their racial difference. Thus, while non-white populations can internalize whiteness as an effective register, much of the experiences and identities of non-white subjects are centered around managing one's failure to embody and thereby adequately perform whiteness. This work contributes to larger efforts to theorize Black genders and sexualities following Lima, and it is also in conversation with artivists who, like Formigon, draw from the continued presence of and connection to non-European epistemologies that persist in the West. I'm in conversation with people who realize that we can define ourselves as something else, as something rooted in both our present and in our ancestrality. So just to kind of give a little more theoretical context to help like ground everyone in this conversation, in my thought. So if we go to Spillers write, first of all, their New World diasporic plight marked a theft of the body, a willful and violent and unimaginable from this distance, severing of the captive body from its motive will, its active desire. Under these conditions, we lose at least gender difference in the outcome, and the female body and the male body become a territory of cultural and political maneuver, not at all gender related, gender specific. That the African female subject under these historic conditions, and here I want to interject something, in my work and in the work of others, one of the things that we note is that how one defines the African female subject in a pre-colonial and colonial African context is not the same as how that female subject is defined within a Western Eurocentric framework. So going back to Spillers, that the African female subject under these historic conditions is not only the target of rape in one sense, an interiorized violation of body and mind, but also the topic of specifically externalized acts of torture and prostration that we imagine as the peculiar province of male brutality and torture inflicted by other males. A female body strung from a tree limb or bleeding from the breast on any given day of field work because the overseer standing the length of the whip has popped her flesh open as a lexical and living dimension of the narratives of women. In this excerpt, Spillers points to how the slave trade was also a process in which the African body was stolen and the mind was severed from this connection to body. And so again, during this moment in history, the way that genders were defined, especially in the West African context, was based on one's connection to Ordi Shah. So it wasn't a biologic rooted in your body, but a much more about a spiritual connection. And one's gender could actually change over the course of one's lifetime. So if people are familiar with Queen Nzinga, for example, her gender actually changed even in colonial documentation about her once or twice. So even if you go back to the colonial documents that try to classify the genders of the enslaved people that they wrote, you will find a lot of what some might say queer things happening. And this is where the Brazilian travesti, Black travesti scholar, Maggie Rayada's work is really, really interesting and really important because she does do this genealogy throughout the hemisphere. What was left from this process of ungendering? So what was left so who was left? People go through this process of ungendering. The brutality that enslaved male and female bodies experience was not only undertaken by men, but by all who held positions of power within colonial societies, including white women. During the colonial period, enslaved people were oftentimes the only property a white woman could own or inherit. These violences rooted in the body and psyche gave another dimension to the narrative of what constitutes woman and impacts possibilities for thinking an interracial feminist solidarity politic. And again, this goes back to the importance of Doris Santana's work, that trans feminism and Black feminism are able to meet. These, in conversation with scholars such as Spillers, Fatima Lima points out that the uniqueness of Black feminine sex gender dissident experiences in Brazil. And again, Fatima Lima doesn't only talk about Black feminine, but as you'll see in this quote, she connects a lot of diversity within Blackness and argues that that is the primary site, that the gender diversity and that gender dissidence, which is a result of being marked as Black by itself, leads to necropolitics. Remembering that in Brazil is the country that kills the most gay, LGBT, trans, travesti people in the world. And the data that's coming out is about 85% of those folks are non-white Afro-descendant people, meaning people we would think of in the United States as Black. Lima writes, Black women, transsexuals, dykes, effeminate gay men, macho women, whores, and transvestites. And transvestite is not the actual English translation, is travesti, which is its own category in Brazil, constitute the primary body subjectivities targeted in power relations, violence and subjection and oppression, in which a necroeconomics of killability, lives that become increasingly killable, a necropoder, a power of death, and necropolitics, the politics of death, unfortunately puts lives that are more possibly killable or more possibly killable or more killable than others who are on an economic downward trajectory. At no point am I affirming or talking or taking these ways of life as equals. On the contrary, it is in the strength of their differences and different ways of being in the worlds that a commonality can reside. Categorical and dynamic markers such as race, gender, sexuality, territory, class, among others, all intersected, compose a grammar in which the politics of killability operates within daily actions. Linking this to the kind of coloniality that Spillers describes, Lima makes the case that masculine Black lesbians face a specific kind of necropolitics rooted in anti-Black racism that is mapped onto various kinds of social exclusion. She argues against an oppression Olympics, but really wants to understand and highlight the different dynamics that bring together a situation that Black sex gender dissidents are the primary target for Brazilian necropolitics. Yeah. So when we move on to think about the category of sapatão, it's a slur that was initially reclaimed by grassroots feminists and lesbian social movements. There were many perspectives on the origins of the slur sapatão, but in the larger political context of Brazil, it is increasingly common for people who are often read as Black lesbians to reject the term lesbian. They reject as European history and dependence on a racialized white normative vision of womanhood for its definition. Many gender nonconforming people, regardless of race, who are classified as female at birth, also embrace the term sapatão as they do not fit the gender normativity implicit in the word lesbian. In activist, artivist, and literary circles, sapatão is sometimes theorized as a non-binary gender category, since it refers to people classified as female at birth who identify neither as men nor women in their gender identity, but can identify or exhibit traits associated with masculinity, femininity, androgyny, and racialized gender non-normativity. Others locate the term within a kind of womanhood, but one that rejects the normative gender expectations associated with femininity, such as cis heteronormativity. What is clear is that it was a pejorative term, and there is a movement within Black sex gender dissonance to reject the category of woman and category of lesbian, as it doesn't represent their particular history and epistemological heritage. Scholars such as myself Riley Snorton, Somerville, Jess Oliveira, and Bruna Bajos have argued that Western notions of gender nonconformity are rooted in anti-Blackness, as it is the Black body that served as the marker of animality, of abjection, of being demonic, satanic, and anti-Christian. Here I'm promoting, or as an antichrist. Here I'm pointing to the work of Sylvia Winter, who developed a genealogy of the term human and its relationship to scientific racism, Christian colonialism, capitalism, genocide, and Afro-Indigenous epistemicide. That is the way in which secular understandings of the modern human is defined, the way it's defined in moral and racial terms is mapped onto a European Christian colonial understanding of the demonic, the evil, the sexual, gender deviant, who were heretics and seen as non-human, as kind of humanoid animalistic demons. So it's for this reason in my essay, Epistemologia Negra Sapatão como Vector de uma praxis humana libertaria, I placed the Black witch in conversation with the Black Sapatão because they're sisters in a way, or even better, they're kind of like twins who coexist and move between intersection temporal dimensions. In this case, the Black witch for me represents the Eurocentric colonial ecclesiastical understanding of Black women as morally and sexually perverse. The Black witch, sometimes called an it, is seen as a gender deviant, animalistic demon who embodies and emanates sorcery. She reincarnates in the modern period as the Black Sapatão. In the case of contemporary Brazil, both have come to exist on the same temporal plane. And as a result, they spark an intense fear in a Western nation that seeks to rid itself, barring from Fanon, of the national fact of its Blackness. As Anna Marie Lara and Tisley and I argue, is the presence of the Black sex gender dissident that points to the Afrocentric vision of Western modernity that continues to be a counter-hegemonic threat, and even more so in majoritarian, non-white, specifically Afro-descendant countries like Brazil. Through a Eurocentric lens, living in Brazil is like imagining oneself existing in a place inhabited by monsters, demons, and deviants. It is for this reason that Brazil is at war with itself. So if we return to Formigão, Formigão mentions how the term caminhoneira, that is the female trucker, the sapatão, stone butch, stud, they're all terms that apply to him. But because he disidentifies with being a woman, and through his masculine identification, and though his masculine identification is informed by an identity based on a lesbian existence, as well as an Afro-diasporic existence, he is excluded from lesbian-centered space. He argues that the women are being lesbophobic because they do not understand lesbian corporalities beyond the Eurocentric category of woman. Here, Formigão is invoking lesbian feminist and Black feminist challenges into what constitutes womanhood. According to Black feminists and lesbian feminists, given the criteria used to define what it means to be a woman, Black women and lesbians, especially Black lesbians or people perceived as such, do not fit. This perspective is centered in Brazilian lesbian feminist interventions into debates surrounding women's oppression. That is, by using local terms like sapatão and caminhoneira, they point to a specifically Brazilian experience of lesbian embodiment, history, and subjectivities. But Black sapatões point to the way in which Blackness defines Black people as gender and sex deviants. The violent exclusion of Black women from the category of women historically is still a central part of people who are seen as Black women experiences. So the thing is that if we think about all of this and we go back to Formigão's situation, why was he excluded from the group? A group that said that it was for caminhoneiras, sapatões. Why didn't they just let him enter? Why did they question him? I mean, they had invited him. So there are two reasons that immediately come to mind. The first is that these kinds of spaces emerged in response to the violence faced by oppressed minorities within the larger public sphere. Such spaces form a safe space for specific types of stigmatized identities that are understood to be targets of oppressive violence. In Brazil's case, just straight up murder. So why did they think that Formigão, a well-known sapatão and caminhoneiro poet, could potentially be a violent oppressor that would place the group's participants in danger or make them feel afraid? Well, if this was the case, why, if they felt that he was a threat, why did Formigão go from being included in the umbrella or at least being a part of the intersecting subjectivity associated with a lesbian existence online to a potential threat when he showed up in person? You know, what were they afraid of? What did they feel the need to police and protect? The second thing is, well, if it wasn't that they were just afraid of him, like he posed some kind of threat when he physically showed up, then maybe they excluded him because it was a result to simply exclude someone they saw as not being like them. If that's the case, what made someone who's known as a sapatão and caminhoneira different from the lesbian, bi, and trans women who were included in the space, who are also identified as self-identifying as sapatão and caminhoneiras? Remember that some of the participants really wanted to challenge the way in which masculinity and femininity and transness was understood, embraced, etc. What made it possible for this group, which is targeted by violence for many of the same reasons that Formigão is targeted, to feel comfortable, even confident about excluding him? Formigão addresses this in his post with the play on the words and in a poem, which I'll talk about next, which is the problem with Formigão's clear rejection of whiteness as an effective register and his embracing of stigmatized African ontologies as a legitimate way of presenting himself in a Eurocentric white supremacist society. It is Formigão's play on words that point to another dimension of his experience, Blackness. Formigão's deployment of the word corpos, a play on the words body and color in Portuguese, his use of the word corporalidades refers to embodiment, corporalities, and race, cor, and oralities. And that is, we're getting into remembering how orality is central to Afro-diasporic ways of remembering and passing on various epistemologies. So the oralities part points to the non-European, the specifically African ways of both subject formation, recording, and transmitting of historical experiences. And here's his poem, Todo Sapatão Preto Exu. All Black lesbian Exu. I'm not a demon, messing with your pheromone. All Black sapatão is Exu. Negotiating in the market, rhyming, I send my message. This poem has multiple pointings and epistemic interventions. It highlights many of the key points that I'm trying to point to and tease out in this presentation and in this chapter for the book. In the poem, that's projected behind Formigão, there's a reference to Formigão's anarchist philosophical influences via his anti-capitalist Portuguese, Black Portuguese intervention into written language through spelling and lowercasing. The essay starts out with the line, all Black sapatão is Exu. Exu is the Orisha, kind of like a deity of all marginal worlds, crossroads, the marketplaces, entrances into homes. Exu is a deity that governs doors, that is, forms of communication. Exu sees and records all things that happens in the universe. He is central to the process of people understanding their spiritual and material paths. Exu also marks the space of indeterminacy. To put it another way, given the intersectional nature of the oppressions of Black sapatões, then we could say this: sapatões are beings that inhabit all marginal worlds, the crossroads, the marketplace, and entrances to the home. Sapatões embody wisdom. that governs doors, entrances, and exits, and forms of communication, exchanging knowledge, understandings, articulation of self. Sapatões see and record or embody all the things that happen in the universe. That is, it embodies memory, Afro-diasporic memory. They are essential to the processes of people understanding their spiritual and material paths. They also inhabit spaces of intelligibility. Then, after saying that their existence messes with one's desire or pheromones, Formigal writes that they are not a demon. When the Christians began to colonize Africa, they defined the Orisha as Shu, as Satan, as the devil in their translations of Yoruba. So just to wrap up, I want to point to something that happened on the 21st of January. Or the 20th. So on the 21st and 22nd of January in 2019, various Brazilian media outlets published the following headline: Homem é preso em Campinas após matar travesti e guardar coração. Era demônio. A man arrested in Campinas after killing a travesti and keeping the heart. The murderer, 20-year-old Caio Santos de Oliveira, stated the following upon being arrested: Ele era demônio. Eu arranquei o coração dele. É isso. Não é meu conhecido. So he says, he was a demon. I ripped out his heart. That's all. He wasn't my acquaintance. I met him at midnight. So Caio, seen in this image, is laughing and smiling as he's being interviewed by the media upon his arrest. And you see the police are just like, it's just like, they're all just like laughing and smiling and joking with this guy. His cheerfulness and the ease in which he openly talked about and celebrated his action conveys the feeling that he was simply explaining that he had done nothing wrong, that the whole scene of his arrest and people's reaction to him murdering a person was misplaced. Therefore, he took the opportunity to clear up the confusion about people hearing he had killed someone. The clarification was the following: Caio was not someone who had done something wrong. He had not killed a person at all. What he had killed was a demon. He went on to explain that he ripped out his heart, replaced it with the statue of a saint, and kept the heart with him, seemingly as a relic, a trophy of sorts, to remind him that he, in fact, after having sex with the victim, had done something good for Brazil. He had saved it from a demon. So where would this handsome, fit, well-dressed, healthy-looking, clearly Afro-descendant youth with an amazing smile, right? This is how he looks in all the pictures, like, get such an idea? The ease in which he expressed his reason and gave a contradictory feeling to the interview. He conveyed the feeling that he was not, in fact, a criminal. In fact, it seems that he thought what he had done made perfect sense. People only needed to listen to him to understand that there was a reasonable explanation for the gruesome murder and the possession of a trophy, the victim's heart. In Brazil, Black gender nonconforming women and girls, and I mean Black and visibly Afro-descendant women and girls, are assumed to be sex gender deviants, and sapatões are subjected to multiple forms of violence because they're seen as demonic, likely a witch because of their gender dissidence, or literally practicing macumbera. So this is macumba, is a slur that refers to African-based religious traditions as witchcraft. So again, a lot of these women and girls go through this process of collective rapes. Collective rapes done in church by churches are very common in Brazil. And again, I really want to make clear that African-based religious traditions, because of their inheriting of pre-colonial African understandings of gender, really has become a site for travesti, bicha preta, so a diversity of sex gender expressions that aren't accepted or tolerated within a Eurocentric, the Eurocentric realms of Brazilian society. So this plays out the collective rapes, it plays out for femininities across multiple indices. So at this point, I'm talking about femininities regardless of how the person is classified at birth, right? So Black and Afro-descendant women, girls, Black trans and trans women, Black bishas who are effeminate gay men, Black travestis, they're the populations across the Black femininities that are most likely to suffer various forms of psychological and physical assault, economic violence, sexist, anti-trans, and homophobic violence. This is something that Formigon theorizes from his lived experiences and positionality as a Black masculine Zapaton. So in turning to the larger point of why I'm writing this chapter, why I wrote this article, and I'm thinking about all of this stuff, is that there has to be an effort within minoritarian communities, particularly in a Brazilian context, to address a minoritarian political culture that seems to be rooted in annihilation, thereby reproducing necropolitics among the various populations that are its target. That is, to have effective networks of solidarity centered on anti-oppression, centered on an anti-oppressive politics, depends on seeing the humanity in each other. This is one important way to undermine the necropolitical tendencies in its various forms that we all have inherited in the Americas. We must learn how to have moments of empathy and moments of tension with another oppressed person. Such a move should not continue to be one-sided, with white subjects being offered care and human empathy and respect when, when they own racism or acknowledge something has happened and being seen as human, or they don't, right? Like here I think of people's willingness to approach institutions that are sort of gendered as white, cisgender male, and to open dialogue about grievances. But when it comes to minoritarian subjects within minoritarian communities across race, that type of opening is not there, it's not extended. So here I turn to Lima, who argues that Brazilians need to dismantle the myth of racial democracy and the idea of cordiality to focus on the coloniality of everyday social spaces and its relationship to Brazil's slavocratic history. For this to happen in Brazil and any other part of the Americas, everyone, including white minoritarian subjects, must do the self-work necessary to address the socialization that justifies any form of anti-Black violence, social death, or exclusion. So I think we have some time for questions.
Thank you. Yes, we definitely have time for questions. So folks, feel free to use, like I mentioned, the Q&A option at the bottom to send us some questions. I have a lot of questions, but unfortunately, I'm not super familiar with the Brazilian context, so they're probably going to be lacking a lot of nuance in that sense. My first question has to do with sort of what my thought process was when I was reading, well, I read the article, but also hearing you present about the incident with Formigão. And that being my wondering the extent to which there are similarities or translatability between sort of the ways that Black men in the US context are automatically, characterized as being violent and a threat, right? So how much of that translates in that particular context when Formigão arrives and is then in his sort of corporality becomes, that characterization gets placed on him when he's there, in person, whereas it presumably doesn't exist in these WhatsApp chats or in the online space. So maybe it doesn't translate. I understand there's a very complicated sort of racial situation happening in Brazil, but I wonder that.
Yeah. So in what way are you thinking about in terms of Black men just like automatically assumed to be like the violent oppressor and then just like social death?
Well, right. So in the sense of, there are a lot of narratives around sort of, oh, I feel uncomfortable, the purse clutching, the whatever translation of what happens. And it ranges, right, in phenotype, right? The sort of the identifiably or phenotypically Blacker one appears or whatever, that the scarier they become in the narrative, right? So I'm wondering if in this particular space, where presumably or explicitly are characterizing themselves as being trans friendly or an inclusive space, et cetera, that sort of his arrival and sort of stance as presumably identifiably Afro-descendant or Black, and also sort of the embracing of the masculine pronouns or whatever automatically then projects that then you must be scary and a threat. And I think it's not a fully formed thought, but that idea came to me when I was reading sort of your interpretation of like, there are two possible explanations to what could have been happening. And one is, was there a sudden sense of fear or whatever, right? So, and that's where that idea came from.
Yeah. So that like there's a possibility of him locating himself within the realm of Black masculinity that makes him a particular kind of threat. And I think that's definitely a productive space. But I think the thing that before we get into the actual masculinities in and of itself is the Blackness that already locates us in masculinity. Right. And so regardless of being a Black butch or if he had identified like that and inhabited the sort of Black female masculinities, I mean, all of those dynamics are already there just by virtue of being Black. And that's kind of something that I actually, years ago, I published an article about that, about how like Black femme women in Cuba can't, have a hard time getting a date within lesbian spaces because unless it's somebody that's looking for like somebody to be a butch, and they're not butch, so they're in this like complicated situation, right, where either they don't get as much action as they would like to, or if they do, they have to do it on terms of pretending to be like this masculine person when they do not identify with masculinities. And so, and that in the Cuban context, there's this sort of internalization of it to the extent that it's Black femininity that already makes you masculine. So I think similar dynamics definitely play out in Brazil. So it's kind of like, regardless, you're already, whether you're Black male, however that person's like body looks, like Black male, if you identify with Black femininity, if you identify with being non-binary, is the Blackness that already gives you a situation. And in a way, what he gives more, what challenges them is that, okay, so, in the article, I try to really talk about white feminism, and I really try to make it clear that we're talking about ideological projects that we're socialized to embody, right? And so the reason why I do that is because it wasn't all white people in this space, right, that did not let him come in, right? But so it's just like really kind of thinking about the sort of ideological projects that are racialized, but are mapped onto longer historical tensions of colonization and resistance to colonization. And so Black feminism, trans feminism in Brazil, and indigenous activism are all decolonial projects that are continuously challenging the various types of ideological agendas that are rooted in a Eurocentric colonial project, right? So I don't know if that kind of answers your question in the sense that I don't think the masculinity part of it is definitely a part of it, but I think is more so of his explicit disidentification with being a woman that opens the door for them to kind of freak out and double down on the, well, we already think you're kind of masculine because you're Black, and you're explicitly identifying with masculinity. So that gives this sort of ideological framework that we're operating in, that gives us the permission to kind of like exclude you, which we were probably already looking for a reason to exclude you in the first place. But if he had been white, then that would have been a very different situation.
I encourage folks, please come up with questions. I have plenty if you all don't have a lot to contribute. While we wait, I want to kind of shift gears a little bit and ask a question that I was really, or an aspect that I found really interesting in the paper, and also what you were talking about, is this idea of, I'm brand new to the term sapatao, but there's a line in the paper, and I think you mentioned it today, about how that opens up a door to Afro-diasporic, Afro-Indigenous, and ontology around gender, or like what that means, right? Like, or different sex gender identities. And I'm and in passing, I think you mentioned the Queen Nzinga reference, but I'm interested to see if you could talk a little bit about some of those different ancestral histories, if you will, coming out of West Africa that do offer sort of a counter definition or understanding of sex gender identity.
Yeah, I think that so I would start by answering that question is like thinking of examples from a US American context, right? So to me, like the US Southeast is an Afro-diasporic place, like culturally, right? And so if you think about when the blues kicked off, you had like Bessie Smith, you had like all of these blues women, and then they become popular. And then like the music gets co-opted when it becomes commercialized, and then Black men are put in their place because people just can't, like, are freaking out, right? But even if you think of them, if you think of Little Richard, if you think of Tina Turner, like if you think of Tina Turner when she starts, can you name any white women that are doing the same thing in music at that moment? If you think about like Billy Porter, Big Frida, there are these ways in which you have these Black gender sex deviant, as they call another term that's used in Brazil, right? To avoid having to use like Eurocentric terms like gayness and lesbian or whatever, homosexual. You see famous people like that arrive to the national stage, but you don't see white counterparts that become a name that way. You don't see if they exist, or you don't see nearly as many that become nationally recognized across like social groups. And there's one person that I could think of who's white that almost gets to that level, and that's an actor by the name of Divine, who played in Hairspray. And but Divine dies, right? But Divine is from Baltimore, right? So to me, there's something about like within Black spaces, even if we lose, and Black meaning like culturally Afro-diasporic places, right? If we lose the name, we might not know the name for those genders, right? But they're still familiar to us, right? That embodiment is familiar to us. And that creates the space for folks to be within Black space to become well-respected singers, et cetera. If you think, yeah, and so, but not necessarily within like majoritarian white or Eurocentric spaces. And so the thing that's interesting in places about like Brazil is that they're actually naming those things. Like we had those names in the South, whether it was like words like sissy, and other terms, but a lot of those like names that we even had in the Southeast have become colonized and forced into things like, oh, you're bi, or like, you're really gay. Like, why are we using the term men who have sex with men? Like, that's just people who don't want to admit that they're gay, but not recognizing that that's pointing to like, African cultural legacies in terms of how people think about embodiment. And I think what's interesting about Brazil is that you have people that are explicitly going about the process of trying to name and define what's already present in their everyday life. And so it's just, we're taught to not see it. We're taught to think that queer people don't exist in Black space, but yet everybody knows that the choir section is queer, right, in church. And so it's all of these things that are in front of our face, and all these things that we collectively remember, some to the point where they're actually able to like point to specific practices, right? But it's all right there, and we're just taught to ignore it or to not see it. And so the thing that's really interesting is that in terms of a process of decolonization, you just have a lot of people who are doing the work of bringing attention to the fact that there's still this sort of epistemic challenge that's there, and that those tools actually, for us to choose something different, is not just some imaginary utopian thing that we have to come up with. They're actually literally right. We're already doing them,
Yeah. Yeah, that's really fascinating. Okay, we have a couple of questions in the Q&A. Our first is from one of our graduate students, Ona, and they ask, I'm not very familiar with the Brazilian context, but you mentioned the response of the police to that incident. How do colonial legal/state definitions of identity markers compare to social definitions in both dominant and marginal spaces?
That's a really great question. There's the case of, and I'm so like loose, loose, I think I can't remember her first name, but sorry, it's like one of those things I'm having a brain start because you just have like so many in your brain. But there's a case of a Black person who identified as a Sapatão that was, the police approached her in the street one afternoon, it wasn't night yet, and they accused her of being this man that had just robbed someplace. And she was like, it's not me. She was bald headed, her head was shaved. She was like, it's not me, it's not me. And she holds up her shirt to show her breasts, and the police beat her, cracked her skull open. So she made it to the police station with a cracked skull to make the denouncement, and then she dies, right? And I think that the way that I think people like Fatima Lima and folks what they're arguing is that what the police see is like when they see Black gender nonconformity, they automatically put that person in an it category, and it must be killed, right? So in terms of state definitions of identity markers, there's lots of laws that discriminate, that say you shouldn't do hate murders, you shouldn't murder people because of their gender, but the police don't really stop and ask people what their gender identity is or their identification. They don't make those distinctions. They just see an it and they kill it. And those its include Black people that are read as and identify as Black women. So this includes Black women or Black women, or kind of like in the realm of being a Black woman. And here I'm not talking about Sapatão, I'm talking about travesti, right? So Sapatão is the not woman, but could be described as living a certain type of lesbian existence. And then travesti is its own, it's like considered to be Brazil's first non-binary gender category, but it's in the realm of femininity. All of those folks are targeted. So it's the it's, that is the unintelligible folks, and the femininities. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. It makes sense to me. I don't know if that makes sense to you, Ona.
But people are trying to cultivate the language so that we can challenge these narratives.
Yeah, so there are a couple of questions. I think the follow-up question, maybe I'll go to the follow-up question by Ona and then jump back to Mirta's question because I think it's connected. Ona asks or writes, a lot of racialized communities and diaspora that have internalized colonial definitions of gender and sex/romance claim that gender and sex minority identity emerged through Westernization. How can we challenge these narratives?
Just straight up history. I mean, just straight up history. And I think, and that's the tension, right? That's why I say, so for example, you might have like a butch, right? Like just a straight up butch in a family that's super Christian, totally homophobic, and it's just like, that's wrong, you're going to hell. But and so you have some people, some families that would exclude that person, but you also have a lot of families that would be like, oh, well, that's just how Shanice is. You know what I mean? So it's just like, those are examples of the moment where it's like that corporality is recognized. So it's like, it's two like lines of code running at the same time in the brain. The one that's the most reactionary one that we're trained to react to is the colonial one that's just like, you know, hate it, hate her, hate them, just hate, right? This, whatever it is, right? Because this person is no longer a person, they're defined outside of the realm of humanity into like itness. So that's the first one. But then there's this stuff that's still like this like noise or just this murmur that's still in the back of all of our collective brains across diasporas, right? That makes it possible for people to also, other groups of people within this diaspora to be like, okay, well, that's just how that person is. And they're like, okay, it just, the okay just happens, right? So the only thing that I would say is just like, it's about doing that genealogy and that archive of history. Maybe one article that might be useful for you in terms of thinking about that is Maggie Rayada's article. The English version is available online too. It's called like, Why Won't You Embrace Me? A Black travesties, like challenge to Black social movements or something. Now, she's doing a really interesting genealogy in that article where she notes, going back to like the early 1500s, that there are people that we could call travesti who arrived to Brazil and the colonial authorities from like Angola. And they're like, there's one woman in particular, they're like, can you please dress as men? Because you know, you're like messing everything up for us, and like we'd prefer for our records for you just to like dress as a man. And she was just like, no, I think I'm just going to keep dressing like we do as accommodating women at home. This is how we dress at home as women. So I'm going to keep dressing like this. So the way that you can challenge these narratives is just doing the work of like uncovering what's already in our faces, and following those links to the things that have been buried. And it's interesting because it's fairly easy to challenge these narratives when you root it in just like the fact that like even within a Eurocentric context, like none of the way that we think about gender today is imbued with coloniality.
It's really interesting, that notion of sort of like ancestral memory or something that sort of lives on in our practice, even when not fully sort of like recognized or you know, admitted to, if you will, right? That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we have another question from another one of our graduate students, Mirta. Thank you for your insightful presentation. I was wondering how feasible it is for you to find readings and research for non-normative gender identity terms, like some of the Portuguese terms that were included in your presentation to describe trans communities. So, Mirza, are you asking for like some place that has like a collection of these similar terms?
There isn't one yet, but that's part of what I'm trying to do with this book. And I think, maybe it might, like, I plan to have a section that just define these terms within a chapter, but I don't know if, as I write, if it'll just result in me just doing a separate chapter that's just like, I think it's just time to think about these gender identities, because there's a lot. It's really a thing and a debate right now in Brazil, and I think it's freaking amazing. There was a special edition of the the CRGS, the Caribbean Review of Gender Studies that I did on queer lombos. It came out in, I want to say, in 2020, maybe 19, but I think 2020. So I co-edited that, and there is one article in there that talks about Sapatão. There's a GLQ article that I just published that's out in the current edition, where I talk a little bit about bicha preta. I point to these gender categories, but also normal term limits the ability to access materials. But that's the thing. What's happening right now is that people are just like coming out and just being like, this is what this is, just deal with it, or these are the bounds of this. So I think what's interesting about Brazil is that we have the possibility of moving beyond the normative terms into something else. And I think that, again, like, a lot of times we have the tendency within gender and sexuality studies, for example, is that we look at what people are saying in France. We look at, like, even in the United States, like the plethora of like sex gender identities that are like trying to push the boundary of non-normativity. I think what I'm asking people to do, and like the challenge that hopefully that my work is making is this. If we think about the West, my foundation is that in the West, there are three visions of Western modernity. There's a Eurocentric one, there's an African or Afro-Indigenous one that's counter-hegemonic to the Eurocentric one, and offers us a significant challenge to the Eurocentric one, and there's an Indigenous one that has this hegemony in different regions within the Americas, so like Bolivia, for example, right? What that means is that you have multiple epistemological systems that are coexisting and intersecting with each other. But what's happening is that the hegemonic one, the Eurocentric one, that gives us these terms that we call normative, are telling us to ignore these other logics that exist outside of a Eurocentric logic, but intersects with it because we're still in a process of colonization. So what's really interesting now is that in Brazil, and I think it's hard for us to kind of really imagine it here in the United States in particular, but something that I really hope my work will encourage people to lean into is to look at the fact that there's this whole movement in Brazil that is leaning into various African epistemologies that are the ones that are the foundational to like resilient ways of understanding the world. So they're leaning into that instead of leaning into the Eurocentric one, which allows the possibility for the articulation of idea of like ways of being in gender categories that are just inherently not normative, because they're the sort of, I don't know, categories, ideas that the normalizing the Eurocentric process is trying to eliminate or make not possible. I don't know if that answers the question, but It's not that it's, yeah. So,
Yeah. Okay, so we're right at 2 o'clock, which is our end time. So let me see if there might be, oh, yes, that was just a yes, thank you. Okay, so we'll wrap it up. Thank you so much for that great and really insightful presentation, Dr. Saunders. Really appreciate it. Thank you to everyone who attended. I know there's a lot going on in our unit this week, so I appreciate folks coming in, and I know there's a lot of people waiting to watch the recording later. I do want to remind folks that are here that our next talk in this series is going to be on February 22nd. And it will be a talk by Dr. Diane Wong from Rutgers University, and her talk is tentatively entitled Creative Improvisation as Liberatory Practice, Research Justice, and Building Networks of Care. We look forward to seeing you all then as well. Have a great, wonderful rest of your day. Thank you again so much.